Ladies and gentlemen and photographers, we're going to learn the basic elements of exposure by me. All right, so the part one is exposure basics. All right, so answer this in your notes. Take some notes on this. What went wrong on this picture? So somebody took a picture, it looked like this, all nasty and grainy. Somebody took a picture like this, and it looked vibrant and clear and beautiful. What went wrong on this picture? See if you can figure it out. All right, so we're going to learn about good exposure. So good exposure is when you get the correct amount of light in the picture. So if you get overexposure, you get too much light in a picture, it's like all white and washed out. If you get the correct exposure, you get bright whites, you get deep blacks, and you get everything in between, and the colors are vibrant. Okay, if you get underexposure, there's too little light, you get this darker image like that, right? So the goal of taking one of the goals of taking a picture is to get correct exposure, the correct amount of light. All right. So here's the deal. So if I can, I like to use a parable, right? So something that makes sense to you, that's easy to understand, to explain something that's more difficult to understand. In this case, we're going to talk about exposure like filling a bucket. So the idea is to get, let's pretend like getting perfect exposure is like filling a bucket up to the top perfectly up, right, in a given amount of time. So getting exposure means getting the correct amount of light onto the film. We don't use film anymore, so it's getting the correct amount of light onto the camera sensor. The camera has a sensor at the back, and the the lens opens up, lets light in, right? Okay, write this down in your notes. A good exposure is like filling the bucket in a given amount of time. If you get the bucket full, you get a good exposure. If the bucket isn't full, you get a grainy or dark underexposed picture. If it's over full, you get a too light, too washed out picture, like we talked about here. Washed out, correct, dark, underexposed. All right? So filling a bucket. All right. Now, here's the deal. Now, I want you to use your brains. What four things can affect if a bucket gets full in a given amount of time, right? So, like, let's say you had a hose and a faucet, and you're going to fill the bucket. Like, well, what could you do to ensure that the bucket gets filled up in a given amount of time? All right, so go ahead and take a little time and figure that out. All right. Well, I'm going to tell you the answer. So you could, so let's say you put a bucket under here and it didn't get filled up in the given amount of time. Well, you could throw that bucket away and you could get a smaller bucket. Or same thing, if it got overfilled, you could get a bigger bucket. So you could change the size of the bucket. You could change the time. So let's say you did it for 1 minute. Oh, shoot, the bucket's not filled up in 1 minute. Well, then you could just change the time, fill it up in 2 minutes, right? So put it under the same situation for 2 minutes and it get filled up. Or you could open up the valve more, right? Oh, more, or change the size of the hose. It's kind of the same thing. Open up the valve more. It's like, oh, the water comes out faster. So we didn't fill that bucket in one minute. So you open it up and you make more water come out, and then it fill it up in a minute. Or another thing you could do is, this would be tricky to do, but sometimes, like, have you ever like turned a hose on and just like dribbling out water, and then some hoses at some people's houses has a lot of water. That's a water pressure. So you could change the water pressure, right? And so if you had the change the water pressure, it would fill up the bucket. It could, fat in a minute or whatever. All right. So those are the things. That's what you could do with the hose in a bucket. Now, what are we going to do with it? How does that relate to a camera? Well, it relates quite easy, like well, to a camera. That camera has some of the same features, really. All right. So on a camera, so the size of the bucket is the camera's ISO. So here's the lens, and at the back is this sensor, right? And if you can't see mine. If you crank the power up, it's more sensitive, and the light affects it more. So that would be like, so if you put more power to it, it's like shrinking the size of the bucket. It's like, oh, we need less water to fill the bucket. Okay. So we could adjust the time that we were filling the bucket. Well, that's the shutter speed. So the camera has this little thing called a shutter. It can go boop and open and close, or it could go boop and close, right? So if it goes like that, it lets in barely any light. But if it goes like this, it lets in a ton of light, right? So you could adjust how long the light's coming into the shutter. And then also you can change the aperture. So you can change it to where it goes like this, boop, and like opens really small, or you could change it like it opens really wide. So so the changing the opening of the valve is the same thing as the aperture. You can open this really big or really tiny. And then the water pressure would be how much light. So you could turn on a light and add more light. You could turn the flash on the camera and add more light. You could say, "Oh man, we're in a really shady spot under a tree. Let's go out into the sun and add more light." All right. So those are the 4 things that you can adjust to get good exposure. Okay. If this doesn't make any sense to you, you're gonna have to talk to me, because that's as good as I can do it on this short. Well, I don't know how short it is, but on this video. All right. Okay, so write this down. Shutter speed is how long the shutter opens for. Okay, it could be like a split second, or some people will take a picture of the stars at night and they have it open for an hour. Okay, the aperture is the same thing as the f-stop. As it's on the cameras, it's called the f-stop. It's how big. Okay, so a 5 f-stop is small, and 8 is, well, no. So 16 is tiny, 11 is kind of tiny, 8 is small, 5 is medium, 4 is big, 2 is really big, and 2.8. Anyway, there you go. Okay, write this down. The ISO is how sensitive the sensor is, or how big is the bucket, right? So on a camera, it has a sensor, and if you crank up the electricity, it's more sensitive. Your bucket gets littler. You need less water to get a good exposure, right? So it used to be film, and so the film had numbers. So like a low ISO value means means low sensitivity to light. Means you have a bigger bucket. Kind of read that and understand that. All right. The more available light equals more water pressure. Write that down. You could use a flash. You could use external light. Go to a sunny spot. Write that down. Okay. So check this out. So what is it? You look at this like, what the heck is this picture? Look here. It looks like day, and then here it looks like stars. How did you get this picture? Well, some guy had a tripod, stuck his camera on the tripod in the middle of the night, and the tripod is to keep the camera super still. And then he like he opened that aperture up all the way to 2, and he left it open for like an hour, right? It was the middle of the night, and so he actually caught the stars moving, right? So the stars were moving, and then just a little bit of available light. It looks, there's just a little bit of light coming off the trees, but over an hour period, it made it look like day, right? All right, so, and then look at this picture. So this kid's moving super fast, right? And in order to capture that, if you go like this, open, close, it's going to look blurry. So in order to that, you have to have the shutter speed really fast. So you'd have to go boop and open it and close it really fast to get a good picture here. So they left the shutter speed open, the shutter open too long, and it got blurry. Okay, now on this one, there wasn't very much available light, right? And so they didn't adjust for that. There wasn't enough light, and so they needed to make some adjustments to the camera. Like, okay, there's no light. So what did it do? Okay, well, we got to make the aperture bigger, and we need to keep it open for longer, or some combination of that, or use a flash. Okay, so here we go. Answer this question. What do you do if you want to take a star trail picture? Okay, well, there's one thing that you have to do. You absolutely have to keep it open for a longer period of time, right? The other thing that you're going to probably want to do, so what would you do with the ISO? You'd want to probably crank up the ISO, right, so that it's more sensitive to the light. What would you do with the shutter speed? You'd have to, so the one thing you absolutely have to do is you have to keep that shutter open for an hour, right? So then you adjust the ISO up or down to amount for that. And then the aperture, probably same thing. You could adjust that, the opening bigger or smaller, but probably want it really, really big. The one thing you can adjust is how much light. It's nighttime, so you can't do that one. So this one has to be a certain thing. This one's already set. You can't change it, so you have to adjust the ISO and the aperture to make up for the shutter speed being open for an hour. What do you do if you want to take a picture of sports in action? Well, the one thing that's set is the shutter speed has to be super fast, right? And so then you'd probably want to shutter speed has to be really fast. So in order to adjust, you would crank up the ISO to where it needs to be and open the aperture more to get enough light. What do you do if it's getting dark outside? Well, you turn on the flash on the camera. That's one thing that would help. And then you could slow down the shutter speed. The only thing is if you keep the shutter open too long, things could get blurry if people start to move, right? So maybe open that a little bit, crank up the ISO, open up the aperture. What would you do if it is bright outside and your picture comes out all washed out? Okay, well, this is set. There's a bunch of light. You can't affect that. So what you could do is shrink the aperture down, slow down the shutter speed, and lower the camera's ISO, right? So you kind of get the picture here is like typically something set, so you adjust the other things the best that you can, right? All right. In the next one, let's go to how to use these little cameras.